Hi there, this is Tony from pianotone.ca, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can get MIDI sounds working at the same time as using the Chordie app on Windows 10. Let's check it out. So just in case you're not familiar with Chordie, I do have a review on it that I've linked to in the description below, so you can check that out and then you can come back to this video if you need to. Now, as I mentioned in my Chordie review, it is a super cool app for learning music theory or for teaching. It's actually one of the most commonly used tools by instructors for making piano training videos that show light up keys, notation, and chords while they play. But the one issue with Chordie is that it has no built-in sounds. Now that may or may not be an issue for you depending on how you want to use it, but if you do need to be able to get MIDI sounds working in Windows 10 at the same time as Chordie, and you've run into some issues getting that to work, then I'm going to outline some steps that you can take to fix that. Now, to keep this video from being super long, I'm going to assume that you already know how to get your MIDI keyboard to play MIDI sounds on your PC, either from using some type of MIDI Windows app that has piano sounds built in, or more likely using your DAW, your digital audio workstation, with a piano plugin.
Okay, so I'm going to be demonstrating how to do all of this using my new DAW, Ableton Live Lite 11. The general approach that I'm going to show is going to be what you need to do with your DAW or whatever your MIDI sound source app is that you're using. And I will mention some things that seem to be particular to Ableton as I go. Now, the first thing you need to do is you need to figure out whether or not you're lucky enough that your MIDI keyboard's drivers already actually allow for multiple apps to share MIDI data. I haven't come across a keyboard yet where this is the case, but there are apparently those out there that do this. So if you're lucky enough that that is the case for your keyboard, then you're good to go. It's just going to work. You'll be able to run your app that plays your MIDI sounds, run Chordie, and they can both share and read that MIDI data from your keyboard. In that case, you can just quit this video and go ahead and have fun. Now, if you're like me and your MIDI drivers do not allow for multiple apps to share MIDI data, then we can still make this work. And the way you're going to be able to tell is, just as an example, I ran Ableton Live first, and then I've got my Casiotone CTS1 keyboard connected. So I'm just going to play a C chord on my keyboard and see if Ableton picks that up. Yes, it does, so that's great. Now, I did run Ableton first, and then I ran Chordie. So now I'm going to switch over to Chordie and see if Chordie can pick up the MIDI data. Okay, so now I'm in Chordie. I'm going to play that C chord again. And you can see Chordie's not picking it up, and that's because I ran Ableton first, and Ableton basically grabbed a hold of my MIDI data from my keyboard and is hogging it all for itself, and the Chordie isn't able to get access to it. Now, we are going to be able to fix this, and for that we're going to need another app called loopMIDI. Now, loopMIDI is a free app you can download from Tobias Ericsson's website. You just click on the download loopMIDI link here. I will leave a link to this website in the description of my video, and this is a free app, doesn't cost anything. And then once you download and install loopMIDI, what it's basically going to do is it creates a second virtual MIDI port on your PC, so that the first app that grabs your MIDI data from the MIDI port on your keyboard, which is going to be your MIDI sound source, so in my case Ableton, it's going to then be able to output that same MIDI data to the second app, which is Chordie, and it's going to get its MIDI data from this virtual port that loopMIDI creates. So step one is to run loopMIDI once you've installed it, and always run this first before opening your MIDI sound source, so like before I open Ableton and before you open Chordie. And once it's run, that's all you have to do. Just leave it running, and it's going to automatically create a virtual port. Then I will be able to run Ableton Live and then tell you the steps that I need to do in there. Okay, so now I've opened up Ableton, and the first thing I need to do is I'm going to open up my preferences and find MIDI port settings. So in Ableton, you go to Options and Preferences, and then in the Link Tempo MIDI tab here, basically what I'm going to look for here is I want to make sure that my loopMIDI port is enabled as an output port and not as an input, and that my keyboard is enabled as an input port. So you can see my Casio USB MIDI is set up as the input port, and then as an output port I've got my loopMIDI virtual port here. So now that this is done, I can actually test the output port by taking one of the MIDI tracks that Ableton automatically adds to a new project, and I'll specify the input to be my keyboard and the output to be the virtual port that loopMIDI made, and then I'll arm the track for recording, which is an important step. So if I go into here and I say my input is going to be from Casio USB MIDI, and my output is going to be to the loopMIDI port. As I mentioned, I need to arm this track for recording. Then now I'm going to switch back to loopMIDI, and I'm just going to play my keyboard and then watch to see if there's any data coming into that port. Okay, so now I'm back in loopMIDI, and you can see as I start to play my keyboard that I can see data coming through. So that tells me that that's working. Okay, so now I've run Chordie, and you can go up to MIDI input to check. Usually it defaults to use all MIDI inputs. You can see it's listing my actual Casio input as well as these virtual ports that loopMIDI created. But I'm just going to say leave it at use all MIDI inputs, and we'll see if this works. So I'll play a C chord, and you can see that it's now picking up MIDI data from that virtual port. Okay, so now to get sounds set up, I'm back in Ableton, and I'm going to choose a piano plugin for my sounds and add it to this track. By the way, if you're looking for a really good free piano plugin, check out Keyzone Classic by Bitsonic. So I'm just going to add that plugin to this track. And just so you know, you can choose different pianos in here. They've got their own Keyzone piano. Can actually go to Yamaha Grand Piano. And I think there's a Steinway in here as well. Anyway, getting distracted. So do check out that plugin though, it's really cool. So I've got sounds working now. But wait a minute, when I go back and I look at loopMIDI, I'm not seeing any data coming through anymore. And that means that Chordie's not going to be getting any data either. So when I go back to Ableton, I can basically see what the problem here is in Ableton is that the audio has switched to master for an output. Now I don't know if this is just something to do with Ableton or not, and maybe there is a way that I'm not familiar with to fix this, but as soon as I add a plug-in to a MIDI track, it doesn't seem to still be able to transmit MIDI data out from this track. So right now it's just playing the sounds, but it's no longer sending the MIDI out to the loop MIDI port. But no fear, there's an easy fix. All I have to do is add a second MIDI track without a plug-in. And there's already a second MIDI track set up in Ableton by default. And I'll take that one. And then I will send the output to be the loopMIDI port. And don't forget to arm this track as well for recording. So now I'm back in loopMIDI again, and now I can see data is coming through. And sure enough, when I go back to Chordie, it's now working again as well. So just to sum up what I did in Ableton to get this to work, I had one MIDI track where I have the MIDI input coming from my keyboard's drivers, and then the output, I'd like to put it to the loopMIDI port that loopMIDI creates, but in Ableton I wasn't able to figure out how to do that. So it's just outputting the audio of my plugin, which happens to be Keyzone Classic, to get sounds. But then I just created a second MIDI track, and it has no plugin installed, and all it does is send MIDI out to the loopMIDI port. And then the loopMIDI port is what Chordie is reading to get its data to display notes and the light up keys.
So I hope this video helps you out in getting MIDI sounds working with Chordie. I should emphasize that I'm pretty much a total beginner with Ableton Live. I just got it and I'm just starting to learn it. So if you have any Ableton questions, I'm definitely not the right person to ask. As far as getting your DAW or MIDI sound source working with loopMIDI and Chordie, try to follow the same basic steps that I took with Ableton. Run loopMIDI first and connect your keyboard. Run your MIDI sound source software and do what you need to enable the virtual loopMIDI port as an output, and then to have your app send MIDI to this port. So in a DAW, create a MIDI track with loopMIDI as the output. And then do what you need to do in your app to enable MIDI sounds. So in a DAW, specify a plugin to use on your MIDI track. And if you run into the issue that I did with Ableton, where you may need a second MIDI track, then try that. And if you're still having issues, try searching for help online for loopMIDI, Chordie, and whatever app it is that you're using, because there are other videos out there that deal with doing exactly what I'm doing, only instead of Ableton Live, they're using Reaper or some other DAW. So thanks so much for checking out this video. I've got links below to my basic review on Chordie, as well as my affiliate links to go ahead and pick up a copy of Chordie if you don't have it yet and you're ready to give it a go. I will also be making some videos on how to use Chordie with OBS Studio to make those piano instruction videos. So please feel free to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. And subscribing and smashing that like button really does help my channel out. And if this video really helps you out, then you'd like to support my channel a little bit, feel free to hit the Buy Me a Coffee link below. So thanks again, and happy piano playing and happy MIDI-ing. Have a good day.